Welcome to the NM Cool podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. NM Cool is the New Mexico Coalition to Enhance Working Lands, and its 5th annual summit is happening in the spring of 2022. This is a time of uncertainty and profound change when so many of us are fatigued from multiple stresses, and so it's more important than ever to focus on effective collaboration and good working relationships. This series of 6 podcasts addresses some big topics facing people who are working with the land, and we hope it helps you stay on course and resilient. I'd like to welcome Eugene Pickett. He's a retired farmer and an advocate with the National Rural Coalition, the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers Trade Association, and New Mexico Black Farmers and Ranchers. I talked to him over Zoom from his place in Belen, New Mexico, on a very windy day, as you may hear during this recording. Belen was badly flooded several years back, and I asked him to describe what happened.
This is a very interesting experience because I retired in 2017, and I had a whole plan laid out. But then we got flooded out in our valley. We had 5 feet of water outside, 3.5 feet of water inside everybody's house. The first year, we really had to focus on salvaging the physical structures, the property, because, it's costly if you got to tear it down and rebuild. So we were able to salvage the house. That's a year. Then the next year, we had a shortage of seeds, shortage of water. We weren't in extreme drought yet, but that hit. And then the next year, the next 2 years now, we've been in extreme drought. So just the overall push for advocacy of small farmers and ranchers, because when you're devastated, you kind of have a different thought about accessing resources, because we all, as small farmers and ranchers, you kind of want to be on your own because you could do it the way that you want to do it, and that's okay. But then when it comes to affordability, if you've gone through disaster, and see, because our community down here in Pueblitos is so small, there's only probably about 700 families in the area, so what's called the per capita designation of an emergency declaration, we didn't meet that cap. So that means like you are on your own. Not only you're on your own, you start developing, a whole nother consciousness about how you're going to do whatever. Red Cross comes out and brings truckloads of water. So people gather at wherever there's going to be to get some water, because drinking water in a flood is non-existent. So going from that and really learning where resources are available, especially with the United States Department of Agriculture. So if you're in farming or you're in ranching, here are your access points. Now, you don't learn these things, but when you get in a disaster, then you start looking. I had to find out all these things. I wish I had known them prior to, because I would have been better positioned to not only recover myself, but help my neighbors recover.
Were you able to access government funding?
Not really, but we were able to influence the process so that people became aware of the existence. So once you are aware of the existence, anything that you do helps other people.
How did you start farming and ranching? You're not from New Mexico originally. You're from Los Angeles.
Yeah, I was born in East LA. Well, see, what people don't know about East LA, right, especially where I came from, which is a place called Boyle Heights. That's a real interesting community. And a lot of times people who are not from LA don't know that LA is nothing but, at least when I grew up, nothing but a whole lot of country people who either came from Central America, Mexico, Japan, Korea, the South, the southern states, so these people are country people, farmers and ranchers and fishers. But nobody talks about that. And then there was a heavy Jewish population And there's an area called Fairfax, okay, just below Beverly Hills, all right? Well, the Jewish people from East LA migrated up to that area, which became very exclusive later. So the intermixing of cultures that were very agrarian, everybody had gardens. Everybody, they have bakeries, all the like my uncles, they were more hunters. So they used to go hunting and bring back venison. So they traded that. And then the Japanese, they were more into the markets, equaling like they controlled the areas downtown where the distribution of vegetables and fish, that's what they did. So, this bartering system that took place, because that's a country lifestyle, they would just naturally do this kind of stuff, so we see this as kids, and everybody got gardens, so you kind of get the flavor. And then when I became an adult and raising my own family, and then college, everybody had gardens, at their house, or, just gardens. And so you move from that base to an adult. And then my father had some friends that had a very large plot in the foothills of the Los Angeles Crest National Forest. This guy had this ranch up there. He had one that was 26 acres, and then up on top where he lived was 24. So my dad and his friends, they were, oh, hey, we got this ranch. You should move back out here. It would be perfect for your family, So we launched a program. And because it was a ranch, I didn't look at it initially as a business. I looked at it as a living environment. But, when you have that kind of property, you start, oh, what do I need to have? Yeah, well, we in the horses, we got to get horses. You eat eggs, well, you got to have chickens. It just kind of like started to grow, and so as a result of managing a site like that, it became a real community-based enterprise, to just make it balance, being balancing equals financially balanced, that environment. And then we had youth programs down in town at a park. So, it kind of just, like one thing led to the next. And that was, that started like in the 80s. And then as a result, I ended up coming out to New Mexico, moved my family out here to New Mexico. And, we've always I've had ranches, lost ranches, and then got ranches back. And so once I got introduced to the farming and ranching community here, kind of my administrative side, they were like, well, can you help us do this? Can you help us do that? Then once I got a better understanding of what USDA is and what it offers, to rural communities, it's like, housing, because that impacts farm workers, and then they have senior programs, they have the farming side, which is your vegetables and your fruits, and then they have the meat side, which is the ranching side. It's just this tremendous, like, whoa, okay, super big tool that had I known what I know now, then I would have done a number of things very differently. So going into that position of being an advocate for that particular lifestyle that I had lived and have enjoyed, it's like, how can I help other farmers and ranchers, especially small farmers and ranchers, move forward in terms of accessing resources? Because it becomes very technical, of how and what organizations are doing this and that, because it's, we've been kept out, because there are what we've grown to know as historically discriminated against people. The preferred group to access USDA services and programs from its inception was white male landowners. So anybody that was not in those categories, you're on the outside. Doing what I have to do for myself as well as advocating, for others, then you kind of grow. And so the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers Trade Association, I was introduced to them from a close friend of mine, Jaime Chavez. And, I've just grown in that relationship.
You just mentioned that, you would have done things differently if you'd known then what you know now.
Mhm.
What would you have done differently?
Well, this is what I tell farmers and ranchers, because your assets and your resources, which can, can be your equipment, it can be your personal savings or your income that you generate. That if you access available resources from the United States Department of Agriculture, then you can keep your assets as assets that you don't use unless you need to. Many small farmers and ranchers look at it like this, that you want to make it on your own. We're 100%, we're more American than apple pie, so you want to stand on your own. You want to be these strong individuals that made it in spite of everything. Well, that's fine. But if you can use the available resources and, that are there, then your assets are secured and you use them as you need them to leverage with whatever the opportunities or resources that are presented.
Are the resources you're talking about primarily from the USDA or all kinds of different sources? For what specific types of projects are you talking about?
I think it's like multiple projects, and there are some very famous suits, that have taken place. And as a result of those suits, doors have opened. And so when I say those doors have opened, government as well as big business has become very open to interaction. So which that is involved for me and the group that I'm working closely with now, the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers Trade Association. I'm now their deputy director. So that's put us in position to have a real defined relationship with USDA. But we have two agreements with USDA, one that's on the Natural Resource Conservation Services, better known as NRCS, with their Director of National Outreach. His office approached my boss, Rudy Arredondo. Hey, Rudy, man, we need to make things better. Rudy's like, yeah, we do need to make things better. Let's hammer an agreement out where you're going to do some stuff for us. And so we've been in the process of creating a model in New Mexico that is conservation based. And it's dealing with, like water and conservation practices and all that, right? Education. Another relationship that he had with lead legal counsel, Jeannie Hip, for Secretary of Agriculture, Vilsack, his lead counsel. Hey, Rudy, we got all these problems over here and you've been talking about them. Maybe we could put something together, and have an agreement to make things better. You think you could do that, Rudy? Yeah, we could do that. So as a result, the specifics of key departments in USDA, where there were barriers that, like small farmers and ranchers and historically discriminated against people encountered over the history of the organization, they were like, hey, Rudy, your purview is to help us remove these barriers. And Rudy was like, oh yeah, that's what we do anyway. We could do that, especially if you're going to put some resources behind it. We're right at the moments where that's going to be implemented.
Can you talk about some of those barriers, what it looked like, and then what the agreements are so that those things get really, what would you say, dissolved?
Let's say addressed, because I don't know, it's so deep seated, it's systemic. It may never get dissolved, but once it's exposed and once we can assist people to navigate through those barriers and that we're in position to go like, hey, you know what? No, that ain't working right. I'm 71 years old, so I'm moving into being an elder, but some of my elders, that have actually had their applications thrown in the trash. I got a grant from USDA to redo my kitchen, right? Because they had certain senior grants. Well, the lady that was the reviewer, she was like, there's not enough money. You shouldn't be interested. Well, wait a minute, how do you know what I should be interested in? And, that first point of contact. So anyway, I said, well, let me take you down to my neighbor because, he had an adobe house. And so when the flood came, we had water sitting out here for at least 17, 18 days. So the house began to crumble. So I take her down there and, first thing she says to this guy is like, well, to be eligible for this grant, you got to be at least 65 years old. And he looks at her and he's like, I'm 90 years old and my wife is 87. Do you think we might qualify? And she gets this look on her face like, small details like that. First point of contact, the discouragement. And then you have what's called the Southern Cooperatives. That's a lot of the Black farmers that are in the Southern states where they were not allowed to even process applications early on. Or you had like the sharecroppers, when the Voting Rights Act first were initiated, were Freedom Summer, where all the students were going down and helping on the voter registration education drives in the South. Well, those were primarily agricultural workers, not the students who came, but the people who lived there. So this whole movement of the white South against Black farmers and ranchers to keep them in their place, to not have the vote. Well, then you begin to have access to whatever the resources are that you will need for subsidies on planting, purchasing equipment. So, this move to keep us even to this day out of the access lane. They had a big thing that came up where there was going to be what was called debt relief. That debt relief was going to be provided to farmers and ranchers who had been historically discriminated against. And they knew this. This was the acknowledgement of it. Well, hey, what we can do is relieve all the debt that you have related to, like USDA loans, whatever category it was in. And so you had a group of white farmers who came and put an injunction in place, took this to court. No, don't give them what they need any money for. They don't need any money. Well, that would have given, especially during the pandemic, where people put out of work, couldn't pay their loans. If you don't pay your loan, then, you will lose your property, you lose your business. Those acts that became very upfront, they're like, whatever it is that may be any form of assistance or relief that you would have through USDA programs, we need to cut that off. So you begin to put people out of business. So why do you put people out of business? So that you get the business that they're going to lose. These are simple formulas that are like straight up front. So many of the properties that have come in jeopardy, that are in jeopardy as a result of the pandemic, there has been no relief. So as those properties are becoming available because of the loss of the properties, Bill Gates has becoming the number one owner of agricultural property in America because he's taking his capital and purchasing these at-risk properties.
What does that mean to agriculture?
Oh, it's devastating what it means to agriculture because there's a potential paradigm shift. So that potential paradigm shift back into big ag means that like for small farmers and ranchers, there's a great possibility of returning to the sharecropper tradition because they don't want to work. They want to own the property, and they're going back and saying to the owners, they're like, hey, you know what? Why don't you work the property? And then we'll figure out a good financial arrangement to keep you there on your property. They don't own it anymore. So whatever the practices are that are a preference of big ag, then you return to what those practices are and see what those practices have done over the years has taken so many nutrients out of the soil that the soil is no longer as productive as it ought to be because the traditional practices are being put to the side so that, the alternatives that if you want healthy grown food, well, certain fertilizers you just don't use, certain seeds you just don't use. Well, if Big Ag owns the means of production, then you're going to produce the way they tell you to produce. So there's this big, I think a big challenge, not just in the United States, but, around the world, to have the alternative that is represented by the small farmers and ranchers, because those are typically farmers and ranchers that are practicing, just the family traditions that they've always grown like this. They've always existed like this. So, in the small farmers, like the small farmers markets that we have here in New Mexico, it's like, it's locally grown, locally owned, you know who it is, your customers, your farmers and ranchers. So you feel, I think, a different sense of where your food is coming from, so it's that difference. And if that difference goes away, big agriculture, the primary interest is the profit mode. So if the profit mode is the only modus operandi, then what begins to happen is you're doing all that you do based upon the science of how production is going to be more profitable to you. Not healthy, but profitable. So that, there's that heavy contradiction to just stabilize that so that at least people have a choice. But if you run the small farmers and ranchers out of business, then you don't have a choice any longer.
So you've been talking about your advocacy and how small farmers and ranchers can access the system of resources that might be available. If anybody has questions who's listening right now and wants to find out more, what can they do?
Well, then all got to do is get the information from you, but they can, call 505-864-3685. That's my landline, or they can call 505-307-4429. That's my cell. They can also call the New Mexico Agricultural Policy Council. Just pull that up and they'll connect you with us. And, so we've, become, the advocacy points, because there are people who are in position to do things, but if they don't know and they don't hear it, then, and then you got Senator Ben Ray Lujan's office, they know how to contact us. So it's like, once you get in contact with people who will do what it is that they say, then it's kind of, it's not like calling 911, but then if you need those advocates that will access the system at multiple levels, to get whatever the scenario, the situation is addressed. You just got to know who, what, where, and when. So because we're moving like that in New Mexico now, then, we're in there like that.
When you say we, are you referring to New Mexico Black farmers and ranchers?
I would say, yeah, New Mexico Black farmers and ranchers. I'll say the New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council. I would say the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers Trade Association. Push those buttons, and then we're going to point you in Senator Ben Ray Lujan's office. Push those buttons. The network of us who will move something and do something, that's what needs to happen.
You have been connected with the New Mexico Acequia Association. Tell us about what you're doing with them, what that work is all about.
Ooh, that's very interesting, because it's like, when you're talking about the acequias, that's very heavy, because that goes back to the original irrigation systems in New Mexico, and people from all over the world, whether you know it or not, have come here to study, the waterways, which comes back to the acequias. They are the original. That's what they've been ever since, and they're still in place. Some of them, they will upgrade and do some of the concrete work, but they discourage that. So it's very traditional. They go out and they're blessed seasonally and prayed over, and, just the whole tradition. So the acequias, when I first got out of here, some of the Atrisco Land Rights Council, better known as the Concilio, they're not as active as they used to be, were really invested in deep in their community in Atrisco, to maintain the traditions. So those traditions that have continued to move forward, and you got the Paula Garcias of the world and, her contingencies. And then you had, like, I think it's Leta Pueblo, played a huge part in, healthy and clean water. When the labs were dumping into the river, that feeds into a lot of the acequias, the chemicals in the water that were causing a lot of health conditions at the Pueblo. So they established, some water purification standards, that have impacted all the upstream users above the Pueblo, especially the labs that were dumping into the river. So, which impacts the water flow in terms of the downstream users, so that acequia flows become extremely important. So on my part, the engagement or the interaction, because we normally would go out, my family, to the praying over the acequias when they open up for the planting seasons. And so those relationships, that, started, early on and have continued on, brought us to a point where we are now. These relationships, the importance of interaction over the water. And me personally, I respect the elders, okay? But I'm very conscious that, like, hey, you know what? Many of the things that we need to do in the now, we have to come together, and do them in the now, that relate to seed sovereignty, respecting, the traditions, and then, how we begin to put that together to move that forward, because advocacy has to take place on every level. Big Ag is out there trying to bring our traditions to an end, and so, the acequia associations, because the farmers that are centered around the usage of the acequia, they have a specific belief on how things are supposed to work, and those things have been working in relationship to, the Pueblos from forever. So we have to stand, I think, together, but at the same time, new things that we're being made aware of, then that sharing of information, we have to employ, like in a very aggressive and, I think, steadfast way of standing together, to protect a way of life that does exist still here in New Mexico.
Talk a little bit more about seed sovereignty.
Oh, let me see, that's okay, you hit the water, that's the acequias and that understanding of their usage. Now, seed sovereignty is really, 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 is very key, because if you don't have the seeds to plant, then, we're not going to have the food. So there's a movement, around the globe of saving the seeds, and the sovereign use of the seeds, because you had like seeds that were imported during slavery, that slaves knew that they had to bring their seeds with them or they may not eat. So we got to braided the seeds into their hair and, hid them, to where they taken us. Oh my God, so, and so then, their connection to the indigenous world to save people, to survive. So now we tie that to the seeds, and as you move the seeds forward, some of the genetically modified seeds don't produce seeds and fruit because, we'll go back to the profit mode. So if there's no production that relates to the seeds, so we're now modifying fruits and vegetables so that they don't produce seeds any longer, and that drives agricultural back to a dependence position. Unless you buy from me, you are not going to eat. Well, what does that do to us? So we had like a number of things that came up in New Mexico that were seriously interesting, to where New Mexico State was getting ready to partner with Monsanto to set up a committee that would review, what seeds would be authorized to be planted in New Mexico. And so, there were farmers and ranchers in certain collectives that became aware of that. So they alerted everybody else. They alerted the Pueblos, they alerted the small farmers and ranchers. And so there's this hearing in Santa Fe during one of the legislative processes, right? Had a meeting at 7:30 in the morning. And that meeting, everyone who was interested in agriculture from a small farmers ranchers standpoint attended that meeting. There were probably only 250 seats in the building. All the seats were gone. People were in the hallways and everybody was in position to speak. The only people who spoke for whatever this committee was of 3 or 4 people that were out of New Mexico State, Monsanto representatives, and the sponsor of the bill. But there was no one who spoke in support. So that sends a message to us that like, whoa, how are they going to control the seeds? That are historically and, family heirlooms that have been passed down, for generations. Wait a minute, you going to regulate the seeds? Well, that's Monsanto over there. So this whole notion that moves forward, that's very critical. Not only in New Mexico, what are we going to do with our seeds, but there's an organization called Slow Food International, right? And they were talking about, it was prior to the pandemic, because they were going to have a 1 million person march on DC about saving seeds, right? So there's this whole movement that's an international movement where seed banks, seed libraries, are being like attacked in war zones. So they're not just blowing up the hospitals and the schools and, like attacking civilians, they're decimating seed libraries. You know what I'm saying? So they're like, it drives agriculture back to these conglomerates that are attempting to control the seeds. They're actually suing people for infringement because they take our seeds, study our seeds, the genetics of our seeds, and put patents on them. Well, if you are going against their protocols and going against their protocols equal that like you are taking seeds and planting them, they're going to take you to court. So, this whole movement of personalized agriculture is very dangerous. Very dangerous. So, like this position and notion of seed sovereignty becomes very important, something that we got to make a very concerted and conscious effort to deal with it in the now, because if we don't, then it just, kind of gets misunderstood, and it doesn't exist, and we need to make it a part of our priorities and agendas.
That moment you were talking about with the 250 people and everybody except the committee spoke against it, did you win?
Yeah, but what happened was the House Agricultural Committee threw it out, and then they tried to sneak it in to on the governor's desk. And I think Paula Garcia and Pam Roy caught it and were like, what is this doing up here? That got squashed in committee. That shouldn't be up here. So, you have to be very diligent. You would think at this day and age that it's not like that, but it is like that because it's big business.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to tell people or let people know about before we go?
That our food and our water and our, soil health is extremely important. The more people can become aware and become conscious and listen to your podcasts and just the planet, we're in crisis. And when you wonder, well, how bad is it? Well, the data is going to tell you how bad it is. those of us in the population that don't have access to health care or limited access to health care died more than any other group, during the pandemic. Clean water is not accessible to everyone. Flint, Michigan does exist. And then we have the soil that's just being decimated and destroyed. It's to be ever diligent, just be very conscious. If you're asleep, wake up, eat right, eat good food. If something doesn't feel, like right, then leave it alone, and just let's be serious about, loving this life that, we have been blessed to live, and, just be as happy as we possibly can.
Eugene Pickett, thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, well, thank you.
You've been listening to the NM Cool podcast. If you want to learn more about the New Mexico Coalition to Enhance Working Lands, visit nmcool.org. That's nmcewl.org, where you can listen to other episodes of this podcast and learn more about our members, work, and ways you can get involved.